Hi, everyone. So today we're going to be covering the next segment of our class, which are going to be behavior change techniques that are used in applied behavior analysis. But before we begin, just make sure you remember that we do have post-lecture assessments. So after you finish a lecture, or I guess the whole sequence of lectures, and we'll tell you what they are. So for instance, today with techniques, you're going to finish DRAs, or differential reinforcement. You're going to finish, what was the other one? Stimulus fading and transformation, and then behavior chaining. So after you finish those, you're going to hop on to the post-lecture assessment. And again, that's not really a quiz, even though it kind of looks like it. It's more for us to see how effective we were at teaching a concept and if we need any kind of further clarification. So keep that in mind, guys, as you go through it. And again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So one of the big questions, again, that we've talked about on the last lecture is, how do we start to tackle these real world problems, right? Because in applied behavior analysis, the whole point of it is to bring these principles to the world, right? And produce meaningful changes. So let's say that we have an individual working at a car dealership and this guy frequently smokes cigarettes, right? So they contact you, a behavior analyst, to help them quit smoking. What are some different ways that we could do this, right? Because we have the principles of behavior, but what could be done to actually change it? So what kinds of questions can you ask before attempting to change behavior? What kinds of questions would you consider, Carlos?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we always remember that we're really specific on what we're doing before we even attempt to change any kind of behavior, right? One of the first ones is, what behavior? I always keep saying this because whenever you're looking in the real world, there's going to be multiple behaviors going on, not just with one person, but maybe the situation that you're looking at is going to have multiple people. So it's what behavior and exactly what does that look like? And after that is it socially significant, right? You remember from our previous lecture is it socially significant to the individual, even though it might not be socially significant to society, or it might be both, right? But it's, how is it important to the individual, and how is it practical for them immediately? After that is, when does the behavior occur? You want to know what kind of environment is it in whenever that happens, right? When is the behavior absent? So if it's a problematic behavior, it's also important to know when they're not engaging in that behavior, right? Because there might be variables in that environment that are very important to how you're going to go about intervening with that behavior. When the behavior occurs, what's its environment, of course, which is what are the antecedents and what are the possible consequences for that behavior. Throughout the entire semester, we've been telling you that the ABC is really important, and this is exactly where you're applying that in the real world. What are those antecedents? What are those consequences? And only after we establish those can we go about creating behavior change.
So again, one of the practices is that we're trying to get you guys to think like behavior analysts, right? So we have a problem to solve. How can we find solutions, right? So one way we could do it, right, is problem solving, just trying to figure out, okay, these are the principles. How can I apply them? How can I use them to change the behavior? Something else you could do, right, is a lot of people have already done this research. So you don't have to start from scratch. You can actually go into the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis and do some investigating. What have people done? What have succeeded changing behavior in your situation? What hasn't succeeded? And you can build on and extend that literature to whatever kinds of questions you want to ask. So again, Java was created to share these findings, right, with the community at large, not just in the US, but across the world. So it's always going to be a valuable resource for you as a behavior analyst. So remember that behavior change procedures are categorized, right? There's all kinds of them, but they kind of fit into three categories. One is that they're based on the consequences, right? Are you reinforcing something? Are you punishing something, right? That's one of the categorizations. The other one is antecedent based. So you look at what happens before behavior, right? Is it an SD? Is it an S delta? Is something else changing the discriminative properties of stimulus, like if it's a conditional discrimination? Is it a motivating operation problem? So again, that's how we kind of come to categorize those. And then we have packaged interventions. And basically what that means is that there are multiple components, multiple interventions that are packaged as one thing to change behavior. So yeah, so some of the procedures used that are consequence-based consist of differential reinforcement and behavior change. Another one is an antecedent-based intervention, which includes stimulus fading and stimulus transformation. And we're going to be talking about each one in turn. So consequence-based intervention, one of them is differential reinforcement. What do you guys think it is? I'm sure you guys have heard the concept at least. So basically what we're talking about here is that we are reinforcing the behavior you want to appear. So you're reinforcing a target behavior and placing the problem behavior on extinction. There are different variations to this procedure, but we're only going to be talking about two of them. So they are differential reinforcement of an alternative behavior and differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior. So when we talk about differential reinforcement of an alternative behavior, what do you think about, right? We think about that word alternative, which means something else, right? So let's say that your significant other is frequently screaming at you in order to get them to go on a date. What's something that you can do?
Yeah, whenever you teach an alternative behavior, that just means that whatever behavior that you're going to be shifting that towards a new target behavior, it has to meet that same consequence, right? You can't just place it on something that's completely different than what you want to have. So whenever we talk about that, is providing reinforcement contingent upon an alternative behavior and placing the problem behavior on extinction. So kind of someone going off of this specific instance, right? Whenever your significant other screams at you just to get you to go on a date, maybe that's the problem. Maybe you might consider that a problem behavior, or just a behavior that you might want to decrease and shift that towards something a little bit more easy on you, no matter what that might look like. Some of those might be, maybe you might want to reinforce anytime they start asking you if they're interested in going to see a movie instead of screaming at you, right? So what you would do is you would reinforce every time this happens and put the screaming on extinction. Another one might be, let's say your significant other messages you and asks you, hey, maybe this is a specific place that I want to go have dinner. Maybe that's something that you might want to reinforce, and you're going to place the screaming on extinction. All you're doing is reinforcing what you want as a behavior that might be a little bit more appropriate at the time than what you've considered the problem behavior.
And remember that extinction means that you are no longer providing the consequence for the behavior. So if they engage in screaming, you ignore and do nothing.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily punishing that behavior, right? Because you're not adding any kind of aversive stimulation. You're not screaming back at them, or maybe you're not punishing, saying some negative comments, but all you're doing is, as Will said, just not delivering any reinforcement for that behavior.
So the other variation that we're going to talk about is a differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior. So what does incompatible mean? It means that two things can occur at the same time, right? So that's exactly what we're talking about here. So let's say that a child punches their siblings each time they want to be recognized for dinner. So how could we utilize this differential reinforcement procedure? So one thing we could do, right, because punching is a dangerous behavior, right? It could lead to damage to not just my knuckles as the person punching, but to the individual that I'm inflicting this damage to, right? It's a bad thing. We don't want it to happen. So what we can do is we can reinforce topographies of behavior, right? What the behavior looks like that are incompatible, that cannot occur when this behavior occurs. Right? So incompatible behavior is a behavior that cannot simultaneously occur at the same time as a problem behavior. So what can we do with this differential reinforcement procedure? We can provide some alternative behaviors that meet the same consequence, right? So let's say that I'm punching a sibling because I want attention. So instead of punching them, my parents can put me on a DRI where instead of punching, I have to raise my hand, right? If I raise my hand, I can't punch you. That behavior is incompatible, and that's what I'm going to be reinforcing. So when do we want to use DRI procedures or DRA procedures? So first and foremost, you always want to identify the maintaining consequence, right? Why is this behavior occurring? Early on in the semester, we talked about functional assessment methodologies and just looking at patterns over time, right? So there's systematic ways of doing this, but ideally, you just want to identify what's the maintaining consequence for this behavior. You can use either, I'm not sure what that means. You may use either one. What do you think that means?
Yeah, so whenever first, just as Will was saying, that you always have to first identify that maintaining variable, right? So what's currently maintaining whatever behavior you're trying to decrease, right? Because usually whenever you're using any kind of DR procedure, you want to decrease that behavior, right? So that's the very first thing that you want to do, right? No matter for what a DRA or a DRI, you first have to establish that maintaining variable. Because if you don't know what the maintaining variable is, you don't know what consequences, you don't know what's reinforcing my behavior, it's going to be impossible for you, almost impossible for you to switch to another behavior if you can deliver that reinforcer, right? Because you have to identify that reinforcer for it to be effective to begin with.
Okay, yeah, exactly, that makes sense. So then if a behavior is dangerous to the individual or themselves, what kind of behaviors would you want to reinforce? Of course, you probably want to stick with a DRI, the differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior, because if this is the case, that the other dangerous behavior won't be able to occur simultaneously with the preferred behavior. So what if you just want to keep some features of that behavior without completely eliminating it, right? Because there's some useful parts to it. You may want to use the differential reinforcement of an alternative procedure.
Yeah, for that last one is what we mean by some form of the dimension of the behavior means, so for example, if I'm cursing at someone and Will wants to change my cursing to some other kind of vocal response, he's not going to start reinforcing me covering my mouth because he still wants me to use my vocals, my vocalization, right? So he still wants to keep this, my vocal responses in play, but he just wants it to be a little bit different. So it's going to be a DRA because he still wants me to use my mouth, but you wouldn't use a DRI because you still want that to keep that form and function of that behavior.
Exactly. So if I want him to, if he's constantly using curse words, right? I don't want to, as he said, eliminate the cursing or the speaking. I mean, I want to eliminate the cursing, not the speaking, right? So instead, I'll offer an alternative behavior that he can engage in that'll reach that same consequence. So what are the big takeaways for this differential reinforcement procedures? Always identify that maintaining variable because it's crucial for the work. If you don't find it, the intervention will not work because it'll be arbitrarily selected. Another thing, you want to be constructional, right? Differential reinforcement procedures don't focus on decreasing behavior. It's a byproduct, but our focus is on teaching those functional alternative behaviors. And also, these effects don't only work with a single population, they work with very, very many. So it's not restricted. You can use it in your everyday life. And you probably do without knowing it. So that's it for this video. We will move on to part 2 and talk about stimulus fading and transformation.
Yeah, and remember that if at any point, as we're going through the slides, we're adjusting to this whole Zoom or online platform, right? The way we usually are accustomed to lecturing is by getting feedback from you all. It's either in your facial expressions or you asking questions. So if this isn't working for y'all, or if you are still having a lot of questions, just go ahead and contact us. We are free to email y'all back and forth, or if y'all want to set up a different Zoom so we can explain some of these concepts in more detail with y'all in vivo.
Thank you for that, Carlos. And we will see you in the next video.